Synopsis. In a dusty coastal town, Aisha, known to neighbors as a simple, warm-hearted seamstress, faces public mockery when a proud college professor dares her to solve calculus as a joke. What follows is a quietly furious, intensely human transformation. Aisha translates years of stitching, measuring, and mending into an original, visual intuition for rates and areas that opens the classroom's hierarchy when an urgent real-world problem, designing a flood channel to save her neighborhood, forces theory into practice. Her tactile method yields an elegant solution that professional engineers and academics cannot refute. The story explores dignity, the hidden craft of intuition, and the slow work of humility, building to a luminous, cinematic moment when the town, the academy, and Aisha herself must reckon with what intelligence looks like. They called her a simple woman because she never wore the right shoes for the library, and because she measured things with an old wooden ruler nicked by a lifetime of palms. They called her simple because she folded the world into neat squares of cloth and mended lives with needle and thread. Aisha had a small shop on the corner of Wind Lane, where the sea's salt found its way into the seams of everything. She rose before dawn, tied her hair back with a strip of muslin, and worked until the moon stitched silver across the bay. People came for hemming and confidences. She dispensed both with the same patient precision. Across town, in a building whose walls smelled of chalk dust and ambition, Professor Karam taught calculus with the certainty of a man who saw his own reflection in theorems. He had a voice like gravel and an appetite for spectacle. He loved demonstrations that left students cowed and impressed. When the college held open classes for the public, he relented to the mayor's request to invite townspeople, not because he believed in civic education, but because a crowd lubricated his ego. The day he found Aisha in the front row, hands folded over the faded blue dress she'd patched 3 times, he decided to sharpen his saw on softer wood. He enjoyed the sensation of a jaw slackening under a clever question. "If you understand sewing," he announced grandly, "you might understand mathematics. It's all patterns. I'll make this easy." He prepared a problem on the board, the kind that demanded symbolic violence, a calculus exercise with nested functions, and a trick substitution. He drew a circle of chalk, a spiral of curves, lines converging like the ribs of an umbrella. "Anyone can solve this," Karim said, looking past the room to the windows that framed the harbor. "Even the woman in the first row." A laugh brushed the air. Gasps, smirks. Karim inclined his head toward Aisha. "Why don't you show us? Solve this integral and I'll buy you a new sewing machine." The prize was small, the humiliation was not. Aisha felt the room tilt as if someone had bumped the table. Her hands were ink, stained from measuring cloth, not ink, slick from conjugates. She had never studied calculus in any formal sense. Her education had been stitches and shillings, the arithmetic of market prices and measurement. Yet she loved puzzles the way she loved the thrum of her sewing machine, steady, resolute, forgiving when you approached with care. For an instant she considered leaving. There were orders at the shop, a baby blanket to finish. But then she saw the look on Samir's face. Samir was a benchmaker's son who sat beside Aisha at community gatherings. He carried notebooks and an earnestness that made him young beyond his years. He believed in Aisha's quiet intelligence the way he believed in the tide. His faith never required demonstration. He nudged her now, eyes bright with a simple, defiant plea. "Show him," he mouthed. The classroom hummed. On the board, Professor Karim had written an equation that looked like a sealed letter, deliberately unreadable to anyone not in possession of a particular key. It was a contest problem from a regional exam, heavy on algebraic slate, of hand, dense, with substitutions and trigonometric identities. Karim expected the ritual, a few attempts, 3 minutes of awkward silence, and the gentle collapse of public curiosity. He certainly did not expect Aisha to stand. She wiped her hands on her dress, as if dusting off a table, and walked to the chalk, smeared front. Her feet made no sound on the linoleum. Up close she smelled of lemon oil and the faint iron tang of needles. Karim's smile tightened. He had not yet decided whether to humiliate her gently or to break a bone. "Where will you start?" Karim asked, a predator's cadence. He could not imagine any start that did not end with his applause. Aisha looked at the equation, and rather than reading it, she listened. For years she had listened to the rhythm of hymns and counted stitches, 2 forward, 1 back. The way sailors counted knots per fathom. A dress seam told her its own calculus, where fabric pulled, where it relaxed, how the curve of a shoulder demanded minute adjustment across many seams. She thought in layers. How a patch, when placed carelessly, created a fold that propagated tension elsewhere. To her, functions were not abstract entities on paper, but contours with edges that could be smoothed or sharpened. She turned to the board and drew noters. No, not correctors. She sketched a cloth draped over a frame. She drew a curve along the hem and traced with her finger the place the fabric strained. "This is like folding," she said softly, and the room tilted again, because no one had expected her to speak, as if the problem were a pinned curtain. "If you want this to lay flat, you cut here." She traced with swift, sure strokes a small wedge, the geometry of a dart in tailoring. Her hand moved as if sewing in the air. Karim blinked. "We're not altering the domain," he said. A hush. Aisha smiled, a small, private thing. "We are. Sometimes you can't make something lay flat without taking out the extra." What she did next was not mathematics as professed in textbooks. It was mathematics as a craftsman's cunning. She removed the unfamiliar symbols from the board and replaced them with shapes anyone could see: the cloth, the dart, the fold. She mapped the integral, the area under a curve, to the area of fabric that must be smooth. She equated the derivative, the rate of change, to the angle at which the fabric pulled. The nested functions on Karim's board transformed into concentric patterns of ripples, each ripple affecting the next. Samir leaned forward until his elbows nearly left the chair. A few students wrote frantically, their pens trying to catch a shadow. Karim's expression thinned like wax in the sun. Aisha performed the substitution Karim had intended, but she found a different interpretation. Where the professor's method required a labyrinthine algebra, Aisha proposed a visual substitution: fold, align, and cut. Translate a curve to a fold to a coordinate shift. She moved through the problem like someone dismantling a ruin with practiced hands. Remove a few stones here, slide another slab there, and the integral surrendered its secret. When she completed the work, her chalk diagram was rough and unorthodox. She had not shown every algebraic step she lacked schooling for. Instead, she had shown the invariant, the shape that persisted under transformation. The point of the trick was no longer that the integral could be evaluated, but that the integral's difficulty was a matter of perspective. Karim peered at the board like a man reading another man's handwriting. The students murmured. A young woman in the back dabbed at her eyes with the sleeve of her hijab, not from sadness but from the strange prick of recognition that intelligence might wear unexpected clothes. "You did that," Karim said. His voice had lost its showman's edge. He had expected a bungled attempt, not a demonstration so synthetic and full of the elemental truth he taught. The room tasted like sweat and salt. Aisha returned to her seat and sat as if nothing had happened. Her heart hammered. Quietly, like a child's, behind the ribs where old sorrows lived. She had not wanted applause. She had wanted to put the problem back in the world where it belonged, not on a board like an animal pinned for show. Afterward, the college wanted to write about it. They wanted photographs of the simple woman with an ink-smudged dress. who had baffled a professor. Karim's colleagues debated whether to invite her to speak. The newspaper ran a column with an image that made Aisha look like a relic. She accepted none of the pomp. She went back to her shop where fabric awaited her ministrations and where Samir left a small paper bag with a warm samosa and a note. Pride didn't fit. This will. The town, though, did not forget. The story spread in the way scent spreads, through open windows and across markets. People began to bring Aisha their unfixable things, a rip where a seam had failed in a wedding dress, a child's torn toy, a flag shredded by wind. They did not bring problems of calculus, they brought problems of life. She solved them with the same integrative patience. But recognition has consequences. It takes delight in making demands. 2 weeks later, the harbor rains came heavy and sudden, a thunderous hand smacking the coast. The town's old drainage channel, promised repairs, budget reallocated, paper signed, failed to carry the water. The streets were rivers, the ground leaned toward houses as if seeking refuge. Aisha's shop flooded to the ankle. She bunched the bolts of cloth and climbed onto crates, but the blanket she had been mending, the one for a newborn, floated away like a small white mare. People shouted. Cars stalled. The mayor called the college, and the college called the municipal engineers. The engineers, bright, efficient, the type who wore software like armor, arrived with folded plans and laptops that could model anything, except perhaps the way panic rearranged priorities. The old culverts problem is flow rate and cross-sectional area, one engineer explained, while 2 others unrolled their printed gradient models. If we increase the channel's area here and reduce the slope there, we can maximize capacity. They clicked through simulations. The models suggested a costly plan: rebuild a concrete trench, reroute a sewer line, and excavate. The cost alarmed the mayor. There was not enough money for such an overhaul. The engineers frowned at data and contingency matrices. The town needed a cheaper fix, something fast, something implementable with the resources at hand. Aisha watched from the doorway of her flooded shop, her dress pinned at the hem, water kissing her ankles. Her mind moved not in matrices but in materials, the way a curve on a skirt demanded more fabric than a straight seam, the way a ruffle could be coaxed into place with a row of tight, strategic stitches. She looked at the flat, efficient diagrams the engineers had produced and saw only clean lines that assumed the world would obey their neat math. But the world in front of her was messy and had no patience for models that needed 3 weeks of reconstruction. She walked toward the town square where a temporary team set up to direct rescue. People made space for her because they had seen her with Karim. Now her presence was a small promise. What do you think? The mayor asked, because his options were dwindling to rumors and prayer. Aisha went down to the river's edge. The water moved in a flannel sheet. Heavy, aching, pulled by gravity but tripping on debris. She put her hand in and felt the current tangle between her fingers, like threads in a knot. She thought about darts and pleats, and how the seamstress's answer to an unwanted fold was never more force. She knew the fix was to redistribute tension. I can't design concrete, she said, voice low as a stitch. But we use what we have. She looked up at the engineers, then at the people cooking on stoves that could double as heat sources for drying cloth. She thought of boats tied along the quay, wooden planks in barns, the large unused rolls of canvas at the municipal storage for which the procurement receipts had been misplaced. Her mind folded and unfolded the town the way she folded cloth. We can make a bypass, she said. Nothing glamorous, nothing with fancy simulations. Reroute the water into the old salt marsh, make a temporary spillway. Use canvas to line the path, guide it past the houses, and slow it with bundles of brush. If we move the shallow point, the flow will spread and not dig a new trench. The engineers frowned. But their leader started. His sentence crashed against the practicalities the way ships crashed in storm. "That's not engineering," he said. "It's improvisation. Improvisation is sewing with a needle you sharpened yourself." Aisha said, "It's what we do when the paper plan goes out the window. It's less costly, faster, and uses people who can work now." She did not say, "And my hands know the geometry of this." She did not need to. Her notion was simple and could be implemented without permission. The mayor hesitated. The funds were not there. Time was. He consented. The plan was humble: mobilize volunteers, lay canvas, line channels around the weakest houses, create temporary storage ponds where the water could spread, and stake bundles of brush to dissipate speed. The town's young men were skeptical. The older women, who knew how to make a hem fit, jumped to it. Samir organized a squad of workers. Karim, when asked, sent 2 of his students with grumbling instructions but hands ready. Old men from the docks brought ropes. Children fed buckets in a game that was suddenly a civic duty. For 3 days and nights the town became a workshop. They unrolled canvas like banners of a quiet rebellion. They dug shallow troughs with spoons of old wood and filled them with sandbags and brush. The engineers muttered, but also learned the practicalities that cannot be modeled. Where the ground hit a boulder, how the current loved the particular curve at the bend of Elm Street. Aisha supervised quietly, calling out whose hands should push, where a bundle must be tied tighter, how to angle the canvas so that it would not balloon like a sail, and tear-free. At dawn on the 3rd day, a sky the color of unglazed pottery cracked, and the rain began to diminish. The water that would have burrowed into basements instead spread into the temporary marshes and the line channels. It made a different music now, a slow, resigned hiss instead of a high keening. People stood with wet hair and mud to the knee and looked at each other as if emerging from a sleep where they had not entirely died. The engineers checked their instruments. Their models still insisted a proper trench was the only permanent solution, and perhaps they were right. But the town was alive. No houses had been swept from their foundations. The newborn's blanket had been rescued, muddy and damp, but intact, rewoven with a new seam that Aisha had stitched on a crate, humming like a metronome while a boy warmed his hands in his father's coat. Karim found Aisha then, not to marvel, but to apologize in the way of men who had been shown something irreversible. He kept his head lowered as if ashamed of the spectacle he had once planned. "I asked you to solve a problem," he said. "And again, you've solved this." His hands fluttered like a man throwing a net after fish that had already gotten away. He had practiced his words and had nothing that fit. Aisha looked at him. Her face was the color of a well-used table, marked by sun and work. She thought of the board and the clever substitution he had taught, of the way he had shaped minds into his image. "You asked me to solve calculus as a joke," she said. "I solved it as if it were cloth. You taught me a trick on the board, and I used another trick in the field. They are both truths. Don't mistake spectacle for superiority." Karim swallowed, a small animal of a sound. He had admired symmetry in equations since youth. Opposing symmetry in lives made him uncomfortable. "I should have been kinder," he said finally, the sentence breaking like old mortar. "I wanted them to see that there is a right way. My way. I forgot that things are right in more ways than one." They stood for a moment, each rewoven by the same needle, a human equation made of apologies and acceptance. Then Karim did something neither of them had anticipated. He asked Aisha if she would come to the college and teach a workshop. Not a lecture. Not a token talk. A proper workshop on what she called tactile calculus. A name he initially found quaint, and then, over the coming months, inevitable. Word of the town's success moved beyond borders. A small engineering journal published a piece on low-cost, community-led flood mitigation and included photographs of canvas channels and bundles of brush. It credited the pragmatic ingenuity of a small town. The college sent out invitations to Asia students. Some embarrassed, some curious, came to the workshop with notebooks and hands smelling of coffee and chemicals. Karim watched from the back row, fingers folded. Aisha taught by doing. She did not speak of theorems. She spoke of tension. She pinned cloth to a frame and showed how a small pleat could concentrate stress into a seam. She took a length of rope and looped it around a wooden post to demonstrate a bound on a curve, and a geometry professor, who had once authored 4 textbooks, laughed out loud with relief when Aisha's demonstration made a concept he had spelled in Latin suddenly sing in his tongue. Students clustered, humble now, asking her to show again how an integral could be seen as a surface to be smoothed. Samir cut patterns on the floor for children to follow. The engineering students built miniature channels and lined them with canvas and measured the flow. They learned that a model is as useful as the assumptions it makes, and that assumptions can be bad friends. Recognition came in many forms. A modest grant allowed the town to plan for a permanent solution that borrowed from both worlds a concrete channel where necessary and living, graduating marshes were practical. An integrated system that respected money and nature alike. Aisha's shop received not only a new sewing machine, brand new, chrome and precise, but also an internship offer from a design studio that wanted her sensibility for textiles in urban design. She considered it and then declined, not out of disdain, but because she loved the cadence of the shop and the way the sea sounded on Wind Lane. She accepted, however, an invitation to consult. Karim wrote an article, part apology, a part reflection, about the humility that comes when one recognizes that equations and hands are both ways of knowing. He placed a photograph of Aisha's chalk diagram in the piece, not as a trophy but as a map. The college added a new elective to the curriculum, applied intuition, taught jointly by a professor and a practitioner. Karim led the course for a semester and learned how to be taught by someone he had once meant to humiliate. Aisha continued to mend, curtains torn by storms, dresses made for weddings, and the occasional student's torn backpack. She also led workshops where she taught young women to measure and men to listen, where she would show how the arc of a hem could be a model for the arc of a river. She stitched into everything a new habit. She always left an extra centimeter as a buffer because she had learned that nothing in the wet world fit perfectly. There was a ceremony one evening to unveil the town's new water plan. People gathered on a temporary platform made of crates and old planks. Children clapped with glee that had nothing to do with ceremony, but everything to do with being alive. Karim spoke and stumbled through phrases about mutual education. He spoke of the arrogance of a man who thought cleverness was a weapon. He spoke, haltingly, of the beautiful arrogance of craft and of how the two could learn from each other. When Aisha came to the microphone, a small, reluctant figure, people expected another telling. She surprised them. She told a story about a hole in a hem and a way to stitch it that made the fabric stronger than before. People laughed softly. Laughter is the harmless cousin of relief. Then, she said something she had not intended to say that night, something that settled over the crowd like a warm blanket. Every craft is mathematics, and every mathematics is a craft, she said. We have to keep our hands in it, even if our hands are not tidy. We must let the world show us its seams and not assume we already know the pattern. She paused and looked at Karim. And if someone asks you to dance on their floor, dance anyway. You might find the music. Karim stood then, an older man whose face had been softened by water and time. He lifted the microphone and said, "Thank you." Plainly, he did not demand heroism. He only offered truth. Later, when the platform had been taken down and the children chased one another in the false night of running lights, Someone asked Samir whether Aisha's life had changed. He looked at her shop where she was counting thread and laughing with a customer who had stopped by for advice. Everything changed, he said, and nothing did. She still measures twice and cuts once. She still listens to hymns, but now the world measures her answers against a different yardstick. That is both unfair and necessary. Aisha's hands moved as they always had, quick and sure. Sometimes, late at night, she would sit with the new sewing machine and run her palms across its metal, thinking of the chalkboard and the river and the way the town had bent but not broken. She could not be bothered with the word genius. It sounded too sharp for the life she led. She preferred the word craft, a steady accumulation of decisions, a small insistence that something should hold. One rainy afternoon some months after the floods, Professor Karim visited her shop with a bundle of old cloth and a proposition. "I need to relearn humility," he said. "Teach me to sew." She laughed and agreed. They worked side by side, passing the needle as if passing a story. Sometimes they argued about a stitch, and sometimes they sat in companionable silence, both with hands that had learned to translate the world into measure. The seaside beyond the window, as if content. On the day the newborn, now with a blanket that smelled faintly of lemon oil and of the harbor, took her first step, the town gathered as if to watch a promise made small and fulfilled. Aisha watched too, barefoot on the dock, the hem of her dress damp where the waves had splashed, and thought of the integral she once drew as a piece of cloth. In the spaces between stitches, lives had been rearranged. There are many ways to solve a problem with equations, with cranes, with hands that know the language of tension. The thing that had once been a joke had become a small revolution, not an overthrow of knowledge, but an expansion. People began to see that humility and curiosity are not opposites, but the same coin, worn from use on both sides. At night, Aisha would sometimes trace the hem of her own dress and remember how the classroom had gone still when she sketched a dart on a board. She could still feel, for a moment, the initial hot flush of humiliation and then the quiet strength that followed. It was a reminder that the world will propose a shape for us, labels, expectations, dismissals, but that shape can be altered by patient hands. On the anniversary of the flood, the town held a small fair at the square. Stalls of textiles and food and laughter braided together. Aisha set up a small corner where she taught a boy to sew the first straight line. He concentrated as if it were sacred. Karim wandered among the stalls, watching the way fabrics caught the wind. He stopped at her table and picked up a piece of scrap cloth, feeling the grain like a man touching a book for the first time. He looked at her, and neither of them needed to say the word that made both of them a little lighter. "Thank you." Beneath it all, the lesson remained plain as thread. To belong to a community is to be involved in its unglamorous work, mending, moving, holding the seams while storms run their fingers through them. Aisha had always known that. The town learned it the hard way. In the end, the thing that had blown everyone's mind was not a trick of math to impress journal editors, but the simple fact that intelligence wears many faces, and that sometimes the quietest faces have the boldest maps. When the tide came in that evening and the lights of the town shimmered on the surface like a line of sewing needles, Aisha stood at her shop's threshold and felt the familiar tug of salt and work. She picked up her needle, threaded it, and began another seam. This time, on a blanket for a neighbor whose house had been spared, because a small town had bent instead of breaking.